I stood there holding my overnight bag, the mountain air still cold against my face, and my heart tightened when I saw who was inside. Laughter was pouring out of my own lodge like it belonged to someone else, not me. My son turned, looked straight at me, and with a voice I'll never forget said, "What's a bottom feeder like you doing in my place?" I didn't shout, I didn't cry, I didn't even flinch. I simply turned around, walked back to my car, and made one quiet phone call. In that single moment, I knew everything was about to change. And when he saw what that silence meant, his smile faded. Thank you for watching my story. It means a lot to me, and I would love to know where you're watching from, so please tell me in the comments. My name is Jane, and I live in Wales, a quiet place where the wind moves gently through the hills and the nights are peaceful. I've lived here long enough to know that silence can carry both comfort and pain. This story is one I never thought I'd have to tell, because it's about a kind of hurt that doesn't leave bruises. It settles deeper, like a stone on your chest. The mountain lodge has always been a piece of my heart. My late husband and I built it together many years ago when life was still soft around the edges. We spent winter nights wrapped in warmth, listening to the crackle of the fire while snow fell gently outside. That small wooden cabin tucked in the pines held laughter, promises, and the kind of quiet that makes you feel safe. After he passed away, I didn't go there as often. I let my son use it when he asked, believing it was still our family's place, a place meant to bring us closer, not push us apart. I always believed that love was enough to hold families together, that trust could be passed down like the keys to a home. When I handed over those keys to him, it wasn't just a set of metal in his hand. It was my trust, my faith, and my hope that the love we built in that cabin would stay alive through him. Over the years, life changed quietly, like a stream carving its way through stone. Our conversations grew shorter. His visits became less about family and more about convenience. But I told myself it was fine, that life gets busy and people change. I never imagined the place we built with our own hands would one day feel like a stranger's house. I never imagined I'd stand outside those walls and hear laughter that didn't include me. See faces that didn't even look surprised when they saw me standing there. When I stood there that morning, looking through the doorway, it wasn't just a house I was staring at. It was my whole history laid bare. That cabin holds pieces of me no one else fully understands. The quiet mornings with coffee steaming by the window, the way the light dances across the wood floors at dawn, the sound of my husband's voice echoing softly when the world outside was still. It was supposed to be my safe place, my peace. And the moment he looked at me with those cold words, that peace cracked like glass. I realized then that trust can be broken without anyone raising a hand, that sometimes the sharpest cuts come from the people you once believed would protect your heart. And though the pain settled deep, I didn't let it drown me. I held on to the quiet, because sometimes silence speaks louder than any argument ever could. I was born in a small town where people held on to their word like it was gold, and where family meant everything. Growing up, I didn't have much, but I had the kind of love that didn't need to be spoken every second to be real. My husband came into my life when I was still learning what it meant to trust someone completely. He had a steady voice and gentle hands, the kind that made you believe the world could be kind. We built everything we had together with patience and sweat, saving little by little, never chasing what glittered, only what mattered. When we found that piece of land in the mountains, surrounded by tall pines and quiet winds, we both knew we had found a place where the world slowed down. We built the lodge board by board, painting it with our laughter and soft arguments about where the chairs should go or how high the shelves should be. It wasn't grand, but it was ours. In that place, we spent winters wrapped in blankets, summers with open windows letting in the scent of pine and rain, and autumns watching the trees turn golden while birds sang in the distance. That cabin became a part of our love story, the kind of place where time didn't rush and where our hearts always found their way back to each other. When he died, it felt like the walls held their breath, like the silence wrapped around me too tightly, and I couldn't breathe the same way anymore. For a long time, I avoided going there alone because the memories felt too loud, too full, too heavy to carry by myself. But I kept the lodge standing because he loved it, and I wanted it to remain a part of us. When my son grew older, I placed the keys in his hand. I remember how proud I felt that day, trusting him with something that wasn't just wood and nails, but pieces of our life. I told him, "This place is special. Take care of it, keep it as your own, but never forget where it came from." He nodded, said he understood, and I believed him. I believed in the bond between us. I believed that what we built would be respected. As the years passed, I noticed little changes. When I mentioned the lodge, his voice grew distant. He visited less, but when he did, there were always new people. Always laughter that didn't sound like ours. I didn't question it because I didn't want to be the kind of mother who clings too tightly. I thought giving space was love. I thought letting him feel it was his would keep him close. I was wrong. Slowly, the lodge became a place I only saw in my memories, not in reality. Still, every season I told myself I'd go back. I'd stand on that wooden porch again, breathe in the crisp mountain air, and let the silence wrap around me like it once did. But each time, something held me back. Maybe it was the ache of remembering what was lost. Maybe it was the fear of finding it changed. And yet, deep down, I always felt that it would be waiting for me, untouched, like a faithful friend who never forgets where you left it. That's why that morning, when I decided to go without calling, I didn't feel any doubt. I thought I was going home to my peace, to my past, to the last piece of my husband I still had left. I never imagined I would walk through that door and feel like a stranger, like the walls themselves didn't recognize me anymore. That kind of pain isn't sharp, it's quiet, heavy, the kind that spreads slowly and stays. It's the kind of pain that makes you see exactly who still respects what you hold dear, and who never truly understood its value. When I saw my son standing there that day, looking at me like I was nothing more than an interruption, something inside me cracked in a way I didn't think could happen twice in one lifetime. Losing my husband was one kind of pain, but being treated like a stranger in the place we built together was another kind entirely. And standing there in that silence, I felt every brick of trust I'd given him start to fall apart, one by one. That morning, the sun had just begun to rise behind the mountains, painting the trees in a soft gold, and I remember feeling a quiet kind of peace as I drove up the winding road, thinking of nothing but how it would feel to walk into the lodge again. The air grew cooler, the higher I climbed, and for a moment it felt as if the world itself was holding its breath for me. I had no idea what waited at the end of that road, no hint that the laughter I would hear wasn't mine, and that the faces I would see weren't the ones I longed for. When I turned into the driveway, the first thing that struck me was the number of cars lined up, unfamiliar and carelessly parked across the gravel I had laid with my own hands. A few windows were open, and I could hear loud music spilling out, music that didn't belong to this place, music that cut through the morning stillness like it owned the air. The chimney was smoking, which meant someone had made themselves comfortable, not just for a visit but for a stay. My hands tightened around the handle of my bag, not out of anger, but out of confusion that felt like it was climbing up my throat. I walked up the steps slowly, listening to the creak of the wood I had once sanded myself, remembering the nights I sat there with my husband, listening to the wind whistle softly through the trees. As I pushed the door open, a warm wave of heat and noise hit me. The living room was full. Strangers laughed loudly as if they belonged there. Someone was wearing my robe, the one I folded neatly and kept on the hook beside the fireplace, and she didn't even look at me like she had borrowed it. She looked at me like it was hers. Every corner of the room was filled with their presence, their things, their careless comfort. And then I saw him, my son, standing there, looking at me like I had just walked into someone else's house. There was no warmth in his eyes, no surprise, no guilt. He walked toward me slowly, almost annoyed that I had interrupted his morning, and then those words fell from his mouth like stones. "What's a bottom feeder like you doing in my place?" It wasn't just the words that cut through me. It was the ease with which he said them, as if I had no claim, no history, no place in that room. In that moment, everything I thought I knew about trust and love sat heavy inside me, silent but sharp, and I realized that the pain I was feeling wasn't about the lodge alone. It was about everything I had given and how easily it was pushed aside. For a moment, it felt like time slowed down around me. I stood there in the doorway, still clutching the handle of my bag, but I couldn't feel its weight anymore. All I could feel was the sting of his words, sharp and cold, cutting through everything that had once held us together. The people around him didn't look at me like a mother returning to her home. They looked at me like a stranger who had stepped into something she didn't belong to. Some of them laughed quietly, others turned their faces away, pretending not to notice the way my son had just spoken. No one stood up, no one offered a chair, no one even moved. It was as if I was invisible in a house I had built with my own hands. My eyes moved slowly across the room, taking in what had changed. The furniture I had chosen was pushed aside. The curtains I had sewn years ago were gone, replaced with something loud and tasteless. The quiet order of the lodge had been buried beneath their careless living. My framed photographs were nowhere to be found, the ones of me and my husband sitting by the fire, the ones that carried laughter, softness, and a lifetime of memories. They had stripped the place of everything that made it ours, and turned it into something unrecognizable. When my eyes returned to my son, he wasn't looking at me with shame or hesitation. He was looking at me with the kind of pride that didn't belong to someone who had earned anything. He stood there as if the walls belonged to him, as if my years of sacrifice meant nothing at all. I had always believed that betrayal would come with warning signs, that you'd feel it creeping in before it tore you apart. But standing there, I realized how wrong I was. Betrayal can live quietly in the corners you trusted most and wait until the moment you least expect it to show its face. I didn't argue with him. I didn't let my voice rise. I felt something shift inside me, something still and calm, the kind of quiet that isn't weakness but clarity. I could have shouted and reminded him of everything I gave, everything I trusted him with, every hour spent working to build the world he now took for granted. But what would that have changed? His eyes were already filled with something that had no space for respect. That was the moment I understood that my silence would speak louder than any word I could offer. As I stood there, I felt a coldness settle around my heart, not the kind that destroys, but the kind that wakes you up. I had trusted him with something sacred, and he had turned it into a playground for people who didn't even know the stories behind those walls. They would never know the sound of my husband's laughter, the smell of wood burning on a winter night, or the feeling of sitting by the fire with a warm cup between your hands. But I did, and I wasn't going to let the memory of that be buried beneath their carelessness. My pain was real, yes, but it was not going to be louder than my strength. I turned my gaze away from him and toward the door, knowing I wouldn't stand in that room and beg to be seen in a place that already belonged to me. I stepped outside and let the cold air fill my lungs, holding it in for a moment before letting it out slowly. Inside those walls, my memories were being treated like nothing more than decorations they could move around. But out here, the mountains still felt the same. The wind still carried the same quiet that once wrapped around my husband and me like a warm blanket. The air still smelled of pine and earth, steady and unchanging. I stood there for a long moment, gripping my bag a little tighter, feeling that familiar ache settle deep inside my chest. It wasn't anger that burned in me. It was something heavier, something that reminded me that trust once broken is not easily mended. I heard laughter echo through the open window behind me, and I knew none of them felt even a flicker of guilt. They didn't see what they had taken because they never felt its worth. It wasn't just a house they had stepped into. It was my heart they had carelessly walked over. The pain of realizing that my son stood among them, not as someone who cherished what we built, but as someone who allowed it to be stripped away, was something I will never forget. It's a strange kind of silence that follows that kind of betrayal, not loud or sharp, but cold and steady. The kind that settles like frost over everything you thought was warm. I reached into my pocket and felt the small old key I had always carried, the original key to the lodge, the one my husband pressed into my hand the day we finished building it. He had smiled at me then, his hands rough from work, his voice steady, telling me this place will always be yours. I thought about those words, about the trust and love behind them, and I knew what needed to be done. I wasn't going to raise my voice, and I wasn't going to fight them inside those walls that already held too much of my heart. I would handle it differently, calmly, the way my husband would have expected me to. I walked a little further away from the lodge and sat on a wooden bench near the trees, one that had been there for years, where we used to sit together when we wanted to watch the sun fade behind the hills. I sat there and let the weight of it all press down, not to break me, but to remind me of who I was before they forgot. This lodge didn't belong to them. It never did. And no matter how much they tried to make it theirs, they could never rewrite what was already written in the wood, in the stones, and in the air that carried our laughter long after he was gone. I pulled out my phone with hands that didn't shake, because somewhere deep inside, I knew silence wasn't weakness. It was power, quiet and steady. I wasn't calling to beg, and I wasn't calling to warn. I was calling to take back what was always mine, not with shouting, but with action. And as I sat there, the wind brushing against my face, I felt something shift. For the first time since walking through that door, the weight in my chest didn't feel like it was swallowing me. It felt like it was sharpening me. I knew then that their laughter inside those walls wouldn't last the night. I sat there with the wind brushing against my face, feeling its cold but steady touch, the kind that reminds you of everything that's real. My hands held the phone firmly, not trembling, not weak, just steady in a way that came from knowing this wasn't the end for me. It was only the beginning of taking back what was mine. The sound of their laughter still spilled out from the lodge behind me, but it didn't sound as loud anymore. It had no power over me, not after everything I had been through in my life. I had buried love, built a life, carried more than most, and silence had always been my sharpest weapon. I took a slow breath, let it fill my chest, and pressed the number I knew by heart. The first call was to the attorney who had stood by me after my husband passed. I told him calmly what I had found, my voice never rising, never shaking, just steady and clear. I reminded him of the deed, the agreements, and the power I still held. He listened carefully, not surprised, only quiet, then said he would handle everything immediately. I hung up the phone with a strange calmness in my chest. The kind that doesn't come from winning, but from finally standing your ground. The second call was to the security company that had looked after the lodge all these years. They too didn't ask unnecessary questions. They knew who I was, and more importantly, they knew whose name was written on every piece of paper that mattered. As I sat there on that bench, the weight that had been pressing on my chest since I stepped through that door began to lift little by little. It wasn't gone completely, but it was lighter, and I could breathe without feeling like the air was trapped inside me. For years, I had carried my love for that lodge like a quiet promise, something pure and untouched, and now that promise had been trampled on. But they didn't realize that nothing they did could erase my name from what was built. They didn't build it, they didn't pay for it, and they didn't live the years that shaped it. I did. The world often mistakes silence for surrender, but silence, when used right, is power. It's the kind that unsettles people more than shouting ever could. Inside those walls, they probably thought they had won, that they had taken it all. But in truth, they were standing on ground they never owned. And soon, they were going to be reminded of that. I closed my eyes for a brief moment and thought of my husband, his steady hands, his quiet smile, and the way he always told me that real strength isn't in noise, it's in stillness. In that moment, I felt him close to me, not as a memory, but as a steady reminder of who I am. The cold wind grew a little stronger, but I didn't move. I stayed there, listening to the sound of the trees, letting the minutes stretch out. I knew once I walked away from that bench, everything would begin to shift. They had taken my kindness for weakness, my trust for something they could use. But what they didn't understand was that I may have given them a key, but I never gave them my power. That night would not end the way they thought it would. I stayed on that bench for a while, listening to the sound of the wind moving through the trees, letting it steady me the way it always did when life grew too loud. I could see the faint glow of the lodge from where I sat, warm light spilling through the windows as if everything inside was perfect, but It wasn't, and I knew it. That place wasn't theirs, no matter how much they laughed or how deeply they settled into the furniture. They were borrowing a world they never built, a world that was about to remind them whose name truly held it together. As I rose to my feet, the air felt different, colder but cleaner. And with each step back toward the house, I felt a calm strength pushing away the heaviness in my chest. When I reached the front door again, I didn't walk in like someone begging for space. I walked in like the woman who had built that space with her own hands. The noise inside didn't stop. They didn't even look bothered. My son sat near the fireplace, leaning back as if it all belonged to him, as if the life I worked for was some reward he had earned without lifting a finger. The others sat around, their laughter careless, their eyes sliding over me like I was nothing more than a shadow passing through. But I wasn't a shadow. I was the foundation beneath their feet, the one they had forgotten existed. I walked slowly through the room, not saying a word, not raising my voice, letting my silence settle into the corners of the house like a cold breeze they couldn't ignore. One woman reached for the wine glass on the table without even looking at me. My son smirked faintly as if he thought my silence meant I had accepted it all. But he didn't know what had already been set in motion outside these walls. He didn't know the power behind the quiet I carried. He didn't know that this night wasn't his to own. I stopped near the window where I used to stand with my husband every morning, watching the sun rise over the hills. I didn't look at them when I spoke. I didn't need to. I said only one thing, soft but clear enough for everyone to hear. Enjoy your evening. He laughed, not kindly, but with that hollow kind of pride that people wear when they think nothing can touch them. I didn't give him another word. I just turned and let the silence grow heavier in that room. They didn't know it yet, but that was the last night they'd ever sit in my lodge like they owned it. As I stepped back out into the cold, my heart didn't feel small anymore. It felt steady, strong, anchored in something deeper than their disrespect. I had spent years believing that holding a family together meant giving everything, but standing there in that cold air reminded me that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is stop giving what people take for granted. Soon enough, they would learn what it means to underestimate the quiet. They would learn that kindness has limits, and that this time, those limits were carved in stone. I walked a few steps away from the door, listening to their laughter fading behind me as if it no longer had the power to cut through me. The night air was colder now, the kind that makes your breath visible, but it didn't make me shiver. It felt steady, like the world itself had taken my side. Somewhere down the road, headlights cut through the darkness, moving slowly toward the lodge. I knew exactly who it was, and I didn't need to rush. I just stood still, hands folded in front of me, feeling the quiet strength of what I had set in motion. For years, I had carried this place in my heart, and now, it was carrying me. The first car came to a stop near the gate, followed by another right behind it. I recognized the soft sound of doors closing carefully, not the loud, careless thuds that had filled the house earlier. These were people who understood what respect looked like. The attorney stepped out first, his face calm. The same steady man who helped me secure every inch of this property after my husband passed. Behind him, 2 security personnel walked with quiet purpose. No shouting, no threats, just quiet certainty. I didn't have to speak a single word. Everything was already clear. The house was still lit, their voices still rising like nothing had changed, but they had no idea what was about to walk through those doors. I took a deep breath, letting the cold air settle deep in my lungs, and turned slowly toward the lodge. Every step I took felt deliberate, not rushed, not hesitant. I walked toward the place that had been mine long before they ever stepped into it. Toward the memories that still lived in the walls, toward the promise my husband made me. My shoes crunched lightly against the gravel, and for the first time that night, I felt something warm stir inside me. It wasn't joy, not yet, but it was the quiet beginning of it. The attorney greeted me softly, and with just a small nod between us, everything moved forward. He didn't need a long explanation. He already knew the story written on every document with my name on it. I could see the faint light of realization starting to creep into the house as the sounds inside grew uncertain. A few voices dropped. A few shadows passed across the windows. They were beginning to feel it. That shift in the air that happens when someone who truly owns something decides to take it back. I stood still for a moment, looking at the windows glowing against the night, and I thought of all the winters I had spent sitting inside, my husband's hand wrapped around mine, the fire crackling softly. That warmth was real, and nothing they had done could ever erase it. They could remove curtains, push away furniture, replace memories with their noise, but they could never take away what was written in my heart. Tonight they were going to understand that. Not because I raised my voice, but because the truth would stand quietly in front of them, undeniable and unshakable. The kind of truth you can't argue with. The kind that silences a room. The sound of their laughter began to falter when the attorney stepped inside, followed by the two security men who moved quietly but with the kind of certainty that no one can ignore. I stayed by the doorway for a moment, watching the shift happen like a slow wave washing over the room. The music was still playing faintly, but the careless joy that filled the air earlier had disappeared. One by one, their heads turned, and I saw confusion in their faces. The kind that comes when people suddenly realize they aren't standing on solid ground anymore. My son's smile faded the moment his eyes landed on the attorney's briefcase. He knew that look, and for the first time that night, it was him standing in silence, not me. I didn't have to raise my voice or take a single step forward for the balance in the room to change. The attorney greeted them politely, almost too gently for the weight of what was about to follow. And then he opened the documents with the precision of someone who had done this many times before. The security men stood quietly, their presence alone enough to make everyone in the room sit straighter. My son tried to keep his calm, but his eyes betrayed him, flickering with unease he could no longer hide. His wife's relatives whispered among themselves, their earlier laughter replaced by uneasy silence, and in that silence I found a quiet satisfaction. Not out of cruelty, but out of truth finally standing where it belonged. The attorney read through the papers, every word falling into the room like a stone dropping into still water. The deed, the clauses, the signatures, all written clearly and without doubt. Everything was mine. It always had been. Their voices, their noise, their arrogance had been nothing more than a thin layer covering what was never theirs to begin with. My son's face turned pale as the attorney finished his sentence, explaining calmly that they were occupying the property without permission and that they would have to leave immediately. No one shouted, no one dared to argue. The silence that followed was heavier than any confrontation could have been. I stood there, watching as the truth finally did what my words could not. My son looked at me then, and for a brief moment, I saw something I hadn't seen in his eyes for a long time. Not anger, not confidence, but the realization that he had crossed a line he could not undo. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. His wife lowered her head, her relatives shifted nervously. No one laughing now, no one pretending they belonged in that house. I took a slow step forward, not to gloat, not to crush him, but to stand where I had always belonged. That lodge wasn't just wood and nails, it was the last piece of the life my husband and I'd built. The place where our love had lived. And in that moment, I wasn't the woman they tried to push aside. I was the woman who remembered her worth. The night that began with me feeling small had turned into a night where silence stood taller than any noise they could ever make. They had forgotten whose name built that house. But they were being reminded, not through shouting, but through quiet, undeniable truth. They stood there frozen, their faces stripped of every trace of arrogance they carried earlier. The same room that had been filled with loud laughter and careless words was now wrapped in a heavy silence that none of them could escape from. My son's hands hung at his sides, his chest rising and falling too quickly, and I could see the color draining slowly from his face. The woman wearing my robe shifted uncomfortably, her earlier smirk nowhere to be found. The others kept glancing at each other, waiting for someone to speak, but no one did. The truth had settled in that room like a cold wind, quiet but powerful, and there was no talking their way around it. The attorney folded the papers neatly and stepped aside, letting my silence take the lead. I didn't say a single word to explain or to defend. I didn't need to. Everything that needed to be said had already been written years ago when my husband and I built this lodge. When we signed those documents with our hands steady and our hearts full of trust. I looked at my son and saw a reflection I didn't recognize anymore. He had chosen the comfort of pretending to own something over the honesty of remembering where it came from. It wasn't just the house he had disrespected. It was me. It was the memory of the man who raised him, and it was the trust I placed in him so freely. For a brief moment, I wondered if he felt the weight of what he had done. There was a flicker in his eyes, a small one, like a match trying to stay lit in the wind. But the damage was already carved deep, and it wasn't my job to hold his hand through the consequences he had created for himself. I took another step closer, slow and steady, and the sound of my foot against the wooden floor seemed louder than anything else in the room. He lowered his gaze, and in that quiet, everything shifted again. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to ask for an apology. The house itself was already doing that for me. The people who had filled my home with noise were now nothing more than quiet shadows, standing in a place they never truly belonged. They came with laughter, but they would leave with silence, because what they stood on had never been theirs. It had always been mine, and no amount of carelessness could change that simple, unshakable truth. The night grew quieter as they gathered their things. No more whispers, no more laughter, just the rustling of bags and the soft creak of the floor beneath their feet. I stood still, watching without a word, letting the weight of their own choices sit heavy on their shoulders. The people who had walked so boldly through my door just hours earlier now moved like strangers who didn't know where to look. Their faces were pale, their eyes unfocused, each of them realizing that they had been living inside a lie they built together. A lie that fell apart the moment the truth walked in. My son stood near the fireplace, no longer leaning back like a man who owned something, but standing stiff and unsure, as if the floor beneath him wasn't steady anymore. I remembered how many nights I had stood in that very spot with my husband, listening to the fire crackle as we talked about everything and nothing, our hands wrapped around warm cups, our hearts steady. That fireplace had seen love, it had seen hope, and now it was seeing something entirely different. I never imagined that one day I would stand there, watching my own son pack up and walk out of the very home he once ran through as a child. But I didn't let that thought turn into tears. Some things are too deeply broken to be fixed with soft words. The attorney had already stepped aside, his work done, and the security men waited by the door. No one was forcing them out with loud commands or harsh gestures, and that was the part they didn't understand. This wasn't about anger. It was about truth standing still and unshakable, and sometimes that's more powerful than anything else. One of the women walked past me without lifting her eyes, clutching her bag like she was holding on to something slipping away. Another followed, quiet and small. One by one, they walked through the door they had entered so loudly, leaving behind nothing but the faint echo of their mistake. My son was the last to move. He looked around the room as if seeing it for the first time, and for a moment, I thought I saw a shadow of regret flicker across his face. But regret comes late when respect is already broken. I didn't speak to him, and he didn't speak to me. Our silence was louder than anything words could carry. I simply stepped aside, and he walked past me into the cold night without looking back. As the door closed behind him, the house seemed to breathe again, as if the walls themselves were relieved to remember who they belonged to. I stayed where I was for a long moment, letting that silence wrap around me, not like it did when I first arrived, heavy and painful, but steady, strong, familiar. My husband's memory was still in these walls, in the wooden floor, in the steady hum of the quiet. They had tried to take what they did not build, and in the end, they left with nothing. And me, I stood where I had always belonged. I walked to the center of the room and stood in front of the fireplace, letting the quiet fill every corner like it once did. The air felt different now, no longer heavy with their noise, but steady, like the house had finally remembered its heartbeat. I ran my hand gently along the edge of the mantel, feeling the warmth from the fading embers. So many years of memories lived in these walls. Moments that could never be stolen, or replaced. They could move furniture. They could wear my robe. They could speak to me as if I were nothing. But they could never change what this place truly was. It wasn't built on their hands or their respect. It was built on love, trust, and quiet strength, and that will always remain mine. I sat down slowly, listening to the wind moving softly through the trees outside. It wasn't the kind of night you forget. It was the kind of night that settles deep inside you and teaches you something about who you are. I had spent years giving pieces of myself away in the name of family, believing that kindness would always be enough to hold things together. But standing here now, I understood something different. Sometimes you have to remind people where they came from, not with anger, but with a silence so steady it shakes the ground beneath them. The fire crackled softly as I closed my eyes for a brief moment, remembering my husband's smile, the way he always told me that strength doesn't always need to be loud. And tonight, I saw what he meant. I didn't need to shout to take back what was mine. I just needed to stand in the truth that was always there. Thank you for staying with me until the end of my story. I hope it touched something inside you, and I'd love to know where you're watching from, so please share it in the comments. If my story spoke to your heart, make sure to subscribe so we can share more moments like this together.